stimulating enough. So, our first talk is on The Hollow Places, The Dragon Slayer's Tomb, by writer Christopher Hadley. I'm sorry? Okay, no, it's all right. I was about to say, please welcome, speaking on the subject of dragons in Hertfordshire and legend, please welcome Christopher Hadley.
Thank you, Scott. So Scott asked me to come here and talk about my book, Hollow Places. And it's a book that really started with place and belonging. Actually, I started writing it because of that, because of a sense of wanting to find myself in a landscape, wanting to belong. Let me show you where. Another plug. So Hertfordshire, there it is. For those of you who don't know, not very far from here, up north of here. And I moved to this place, 17 years ago, on the Hertfordshire-Essex border. These are the Pelhams, the three Pelhams. And I'd moved from London, and I felt completely unmoored and out of place. I certainly didn't feel I belonged to this very claustrophobic village. I was stuck at home all day looking after the kids, trying to write. And I suppose my writerly solution to that was to go and find the stories, find all the old stories about the place. And it became apparent to me that to belong to somewhere, you do need to know its stories. I think people told stories in part in the past. They told stories about the hills and the rivers and the trees and the tombs in the church and their forebears and their neighbours, so that they belonged to a place, and also so that they would feel the place belonged to them. And I think that worked. I only realised this as I wrote the book and worked on it. It worked because these stories were not dead stories. In some ways, many of them are still not dead. They're still unfolding. And they were unfolding for the people who told them and the people who listened to them and repeated them and kept them going over the years. The people who told them and listened to them became characters in the stories. And as I learned, especially in the first part of my book, the research for the first part, people who were telling these stories could well become part of these stories and modify them and change them and get passed on down through the centuries. So I'm just going to read a little bit that hopefully conveys how I felt at this point. I think it will resonate with a lot of people in the room, because I like to know where dragons once lurked and where the local fairies baked their loaves, where wolves were trapped and suicides buried, who cast the church bells, which side the lord of the manor took in the Civil War, and which modern surnames were found in the first parish register, and which in the records of the assize. I'm with Walter Scott, who was but half satisfied with the most beautiful scenery if you could not connect it with some local legend. To map a place and to know its stories is to belong, to find companionship with the living and the dead, to time travel on every visit to the brewery tap or the Black Horse. Sometimes you spot something, a burial mound, a scratch dial in the church, and then set out to find its story. Other times you hear a story and go in search of it in the landscape or the archive or someone's memories. And that is how my journey to Great Pepsell's Field and the spot where Master Lawrence felled a yew tree began. Old stories. Okay, so I probably should tell you a bit about this yew tree, because it became extremely important to me, and it wasn't the obvious sort of centre of the story of Piers Shonks. Well, when I was sort of starting to find out about the village and about the field names and what had happened in the Civil War, I came across this story on the website about Piers Shonks in the next village in Brent Pelham, in the church. There was a tomb of this dragon slayer, Piers Shonks, and the story went that in 1086, Shonks went out into the countryside and slayed this dragon that had been ravaging the local farms and crops. And having done this, the devil suddenly appeared, very wrathful with Shonks, because he said it was his favourite dragon, and said to him he would have his soul, whether he was buried within the church or without the church. And so, depending on which version you read, in this version, Shonks took his bow and arrow and said he would be buried where the arrow struck the wall. So shades of Robin Hood getting involved. And the arrow flew through the chancel window and into the north wall of the nave. And Shonks was buried there in the wall, not in the church, not out of the church, and so his soul was saved. It's an intriguing little legend, and the tomb was still there, this wonderful tomb which I'll come to. But there was an added little extra bit which said that the dragon had lived under a yew tree, in a cave under this yew tree, on the boundary of Great Pepsell's Field. And I was a complete sucker for this specificity, you know, the name of the field and this wonderful, evoking this wonderful yew tree. And even more so when I came across, as I started to research it, I came across a series of letters from a vicar called Walmer Wigram. It's like a name, like a hard-wearing fabric, a fantastic name. And he wrote this series of four letters, and the first was in 1888. And he told the story of what had happened with this yew tree some years before. And he said Master Lawrence and some farm labourers had been sent to fell the tree. And it was a great girt yew with vast split trunks and a stile set in the middle of it. And off they went one winter's morning to fell it. And they had a terrible time doing it, an unbugging time. And they eventually gave up and went away for breakfast. And when they came back, they were horrified to find the tree had disappeared. It had collapsed into a cavity in the chalk beneath it. And they looked down into that hole, and no doubt they looked across the fields towards the Hertfordshire spike of St Mary's Church, where Piers Shonks slept, and they decided they had found the lair of the dragon that Shonks had killed all those centuries before. That's wonderful, isn't it? And it just set off all these questions in my head, all the obvious things, like where was Great Pepsell's Field? Was it a real field? Could I find it? Why was there an ancient yew tree growing there? And why on earth were they sent to fell it that morning? I wanted to know particularly about these men, about their mental lives. The stories are ways of getting at the mental lives of ordinary people from the past, as you know. And I wanted to find out, most of all, is did they really believe they'd found a dragon's lair? And if they did, why? What were the explanations? And that became the first part of my book, the first 10 chapters in a book which is really about a tomb. I don't get to the tomb until about chapter 11, to the dismay of my editor for some time. But I insisted upon it because where it all started for me was this yew tree. And I traced it through the countryside and through the archive and try and take you on that journey. And I think there were lots of reasons those men that morning thought they'd found a dragon's lair. I believe they did think they'd found a dragon's lair. But most of all, and thankfully given the title of this conference, I think landscape played a huge part in it, the haunted landscape. Here we go. So the spot was oddly remote. It is the landscape of M.R. James's ghost story, A Neighbour's Landmark. That is, 1 minute picturesque, the next, with the changing of the light, bleak, frightening and vulnerable to supernature. Imagine this spot on a grey winter's morning, setting your axe to a village landmark, and the only building in view is the tower of the church, within whose walls an ancient legend sleeps. Marked by a small triangle where 3 fields meet, hemmed by 3 parish boundaries and 2 dark blocks of woodland, it was the kind of place where gallows once stood, places where suicides and strangers were buried. Yews are known to have been used as hanging trees, and such knowledge might well have worked upon the minds of those men that morning. The local antiquary, W.B. Garish, is good on this, writing of an older time, of the medieval winter when the spirit world was abroad, riding in every gale, hiding in the early and late darkness of evening among the shadows of the farmhouse, of the rickyard, of the misty meadows, of the darksome wood. Ghosts, we talk about ghosts, but our ancestors lived with them from All Hallows to Candlemas. R.M. Healy, in his Shell Guide to Hertfordshire, is generous about the countryside thereabouts, finding in it Samuel Palmer's elegiac landscape paintings, Bedder Palmer's dark etchings from his final years, after he had grown angry at the plight of the agricultural labourer. In the right weather, the wrong weather, the view belongs in the old nurse's tale that troubled Jane Eyre's imagination, making her think of Thomas Bewick's engraving of a black horn thing, seated aloof on a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows. But so would many such views in England. The historian John Lawson has written about the popular sense of an eternal cosmic battle between good and evil that is being fought out in an essentially rural context. Our Yew site is a place as good as any for such battles, for stories, for putting ideas in men's heads about dragons and their slayers. Was it the place, as much as the belief that a dragon once stalked those parts, that would soon make them think they'd found a dragon's lair? So I had great fun searching for this yew tree. going out into the landscape and going out and finding it in the archive as well. But eventually I did have to turn my attention to the tomb. Here it is. Here's its setting in the north wall of the nave, underneath the window in a niche. And it is a remarkable tomb. It's this thick grey-black, blue-black marble slab placed into the wall with these extraordinary carvings on it. You can see a central floriated cross. We've got the Archangel Michael carrying a soul in a napkin surrounded by the four evangelists, the symbols of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then at the bottom you have this malevolent dragon, perhaps breathing fire. It's important to me that it's breathing fire, but it's a moot point. And in the book, I kind of make a point of saying early on, this is not an exceptional thing. Well, it's not an exceptional tomb, it's not an exceptional story. You know, many books out there claim to be the thing that changed the world or launched 1,000 ships. It's just another old tale that stands for all those old tales many villages had. But the more I researched this tomb and spent time with it, the more I began to realize what a remarkable work of art it is. Writers have called it the remarkable tomb of Piers Shonks, or the curious tomb, the peculiar, far-famed, celebrated, unusual, fine, interesting, most interesting, elaborate, and on numerous occasions singular tomb. A singular monument, writes George Cook in 1825, singular, that is unique, much beyond the average, extraordinary, eccentric, or strange. We should bear in mind that its singularity might not be because it was alone of its kind, but alone amongst its survivors. It has been estimated that only 10% of cross slabs have survived, perhaps even fewer. While stressing that you rarely see two cross slabs that look the same, one Victorian expert called Shonks' tomb a curious example that was not easily classified. The great Pevsner hardly ever mentions cross slabs in his architectural guides to the English counties, even when they are the oldest object in the church, lament Brian and Maura Gittos. But he singles out Shonks' tomb for admiration, and the Gittoses themselves do not hold back, choosing it as one of two examples of a highly individual commission before concluding, "Here is drama indeed, and a unique composition." And all these judgments sort of pale alongside the next bit, because my favourite celebration of the tomb comes from the 17th century writer John Weaver. In his 1631 Ancient Funeral Monuments, he copies an earlier account, word for word, beginning his description with, "In the wall of this church lieth a most ancient monument." But in the unpublished draft of his book, Weaver originally added something of his own, writing, "In the wall of this church lieth a wondrous strange ancient monument." The morning spent at the Society of Antiquaries reading through Weaver's archives was more than worth those two adjectives from the poet. Wondrous strange, the wonder and the strangeness of it. And I came to realize that this is a special work of art, and it's partly the secret of its success as a story. I think people still responded to it long after they forgot what it meant. And I spent quite a long time in the book looking at a number of the antiquaries and topographical artists who came and drew the tomb or painted the tomb in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it gives you an excuse to tell some wonderful stories about them. This was the earliest sketch we have at the tomb in a manuscript at the British Library by William Cole, the Cambridge antiquary. And he rarely ever came out of Cambridge, but he came down to Hertfordshire to see this tomb. And fortunately for colour, he stayed with the very disreputable William Wright, who was also, at that time, he was the lord of the manor of Shonks. And William Wright was described as living with, very disreputably, with hogs and dogs and litter and lice and 4 strapping wenches who were there to serve to his every need. And right at the end of this account, and this just shows us how history, it's very difficult to get in touch with the past, because Cole tells us as an afterthought at the end of his notes, in a footnote, that William Wright had fallen off his horse and no longer had any use of his limbs. The poor man was obviously quadriplegic and lived in this vast house, in this one corner of it that was falling down. Possibly my favourite artist is the worst of them all, this fellow Henry Oldfield, a very impecunious artist who painted thousands of pictures of tombs and country houses, and and then was forgotten. And his pictures were attributed to someone else for many, many years until this kind of merciful act of scholarship reunited them with the memory of Henry Oldfield, who we last hear of in debtor's jail, writing desperately to Richard Gough, asking if he would like to buy some more of his pictures. And they're awful. They're inaccurate. But you still can learn so much from them. If anything, it sort of speaks to the elusiveness of the tomb. It's quite evasive. It is there. It's quite hard to see, just on practical terms. It's in a darkened niche. And you can imagine trying to draw it in the 18th century, in the 19th century. And people argue about what the symbols on it mean and what they actually, in those days, they're arguing about what they are. So I spent a lot of time looking at these different artists. And then finally, I think we can come to terms with what it is. This is a stitched together mosaic photograph a friend of mine managed to take, where you can see the whole surface of the tomb in the niche. And once you know what's on it, we can start to have a look at purgatory and what a tomb was supposed to do back in the 13th century. And how that got corrupted and tumbled around and changed with the Reformation. It got damaged by the iconoclasts, either in the Reformation or in the Puritan era. And it is fuel for the fabulous stories and comes together with other stories. The same section of the book where I talk about the tomb, I go down to Dorset because I want to see the quarries it came from. I was fascinated that, in the 1280s, this high-status tomb ends up in this little parish church in Hertfordshire. Very unusual for a Purbeck marble tomb to find its way there. Went down there, had a great time, and it takes me back to the landscape. I've numbered all these. But it would help if I remembered which numbers I'd read so far. Okay, here we go. Walk south of the chalk into the valley, then up the dip slope of the South Purbeck Downs, and you're standing on the Purbeck limestone, tipped and folded confusingly by the same orogeny that raised the Alps 35 million years ago. By some counts, there are 70 strata within the Purbeck group, encompassing 160 million years or more of Earth's history. In their explorations of the stone they named feather and thornback and skybed, the stonecutters of Purbeck travelled across deep time to the boundary between the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. The marble in the upper beds makes up only a very small slice of the Purbeck stone. This most precious stratum of the group runs from west to east with complex inconsistency, and along that line of rock are the Isle's most famous medieval quarries, Dunshay, Quar, and Wilkeswood amongst them. Now, I've been told by an expert I met down there that he thought it came from Dunsay. He thought the blue-black marble of the tomb had come from Dunsay. So it is Dunsay I'm most interested in now. The landscape approaching the manor house and farm is roughed out by generations past, pitted with bowls where men have cleaved and wrenched the footings out, so the ceiling of the world has fallen in, and the marble that once held up the land is many miles away, holding up clerestories and vaultings, and memorialising men and women who died when Henry III was on the throne, and the keep of Corfe Castle was rendered and painted white as the chalk. There is little for me to see other than the unnatural egg-carting grasslands. The earth hides its secret chambers. Tumble-down fields abandoned to woodland hint at workings, no less than barbed wire and electric fences that seem to be keeping you out of these hollow places. But if you were to hurdle them and explore, there is nothing to see over the full summits but more grass and dandelions, scattered on the surface like a force 5 at sea. Somewhere beneath my feet, down beneath those dandelions, beneath the turf and the mud and the shale, is a hollow space where Shonks' tomb was hacked from the earth. And it took me back to the landscape. And we think we know that the tomb was carved down there because it was such an unforgiving type of stone that only Purbeck marblers would be used to working with it. There may have been some in London at the time, but the chances are it was made down there and the carvings were done by someone down there. So you can't help but want to look for traces of the local landscape and of the seascape in the tomb. And I started trying to explore that in the book. The night before I left Dorset, I went for fish and chips in the Greyhound Inn and met this lovely couple. I was in a little alcove, and so they sort of shared it with me. And they were retired teachers. And they said, you must go to Steve Etch's fossil museum in Kimmeridge. And I'd planned to go off early in the morning, but they tempted me and I stayed and I went there. And I was so glad I did because I met Steve Etches, had a brief chat with him. And he told me that back in the 19th century that sculptors were employed by museums and places like the Natural History Museum to clean up the fossils. And so he created this image of extracting, and I can't pronounce this, ichthyosaurs, extracting these marvelous creatures from the rocks, from the fossils, or rather cleaning them up and finding them in the rock in a kind of similar way as the sculptors and the masons extracting a dragon from that rock. And those guys back in the 13th century working in the mines must have found fossils. So the rock, it's a false marble, Purbeck marble. It's made of millions of tiny little snail shells. And that led me to, I already knew that, there's a brilliant book by Adrian Mayer, some of you might know, in which he talks about the origins of dragon stories. One of the possible origins of dragon stories comes from perhaps fossils found in antiquity. And she builds a very compelling case for coincidences between known fossil beds and fossils that were found by the ancient Greeks, and the stories that started to be told about griffins and cyclops. She assembles the bones of a mammoth to show how it could look like a cyclops. And we know that dinosaur bones were being assembled incorrectly in the 20th century. So it's really quite compelling, but not more so than this image, which is on a Greek crater. It's on the cover of her book. But to me, that is a fossilized skull in a cliff face. And we know in these particular fossil beds, they were there and the cliff face is falling out. And there is an image of Perseus fighting the dragon. So I love that, and it ties in with the fossils in Kimmeridge. But we mustn't confuse sort of the general origins, of which there are possibly many, of the dragon motif in stories, with the very specific ones of this story. There was a W.B. Garish, who I've already mentioned, got very confused by it and wrote these letters to the Natural History Museum, thinking that maybe the story of Shonks memorialized a fight between a prehistoric inhabitant of the village and a dinosaur. And he thought maybe these men had found dinosaur bones in the hole when they felled the yew tree. So had great fun researching dragons through the bestiaries and the manuscripts. I've sneaked that into the book. That's my son was quite young. My oldest son, who was quite young at the time, drew that for me from a manuscript at the British Library. But dragons were not the only creatures in the story. There were imps, there was the devil, as I've already told you, and there were giants in the story. Robin Hood finds his way into it, and you can trace these accretions through the years where the imp becomes the dragon, and the dragon, there's a separate strand with a giant in it. And then you can see the point at which the Robin Hood legend enters the story. And my favorite story is actually, it's not really a myth, but it's more like the germ of a ghost story. And it's in the 1830s, and it's told by a lovely old lady called Marion Hudson, who was interviewed in the early 20th century. And she remembered being a little girl in the village, and she remembers the tomb being opened in the 1830s. And the two church wardens, Mr. Brand and Mr. Morris, opened the tomb and took from it finger bones, the finger bones of Shonks. And she said they were giant finger bones, and they were double jointed. And Mr. Morris took his home and put it in a glass corner cabinet. He was a local farmer. And never got any rest. So the tomb had to be reopened and the finger bone replaced. And she finishes with this lovely quaint phrase where she said, Mr. Brand never knew the going of his bone. So I'm trying to write the script for this now. I love that story. So lots of influences on the story and the legend and how it gets modified. But the final part of the book, is probably the hardest to research, is I wanted to find, of course, if there was an historical origin to Piers Shonks and whether he really existed. All right, another reading. I even started to doubt that Piers Shonks was a real name. Try the phone book or Facebook. Shonks and its variants are thin on the ground. It sounded like a crossword clue. Perhaps that is why the O was needed, or a riddle. Piers, just to explain, The O, because he's often referred to as O. Piers Shonks, quite mysteriously. Well, I think we've solved that one. But perhaps that is why the O was needed. Or a riddle. Piers or pierce is very reminiscent of the idea that the cross is piercing the carving of the dragon, that his sword or spear or arrow is piercing the dragon of the tail. And Shonks, the supposed giant of a man with its echo of shanks or long shanks. If you were going to make up a medieval name for a medieval folk hero, you could do a lot worse. Except that perhaps Piers Shonks certainly did. Exist. I found him by chance one day in the hairy book. There it is, not looking particularly hairy there. In a large blue clamshell box on a table in a 1930s brick-faced block at the heart of London's Clerkenwell sits an 800-year-old hairy book, the hairy book. It has had other names. In 1447, when Dean Thomas Lisieux catalogued the 17 great record books of Old St. Paul's Cathedral, 13 of them were lettered A to N. There was no modern J in case you were counting. The hairy book was Book A, or Liber A, not because it was the earliest, most beautiful, or most important, but simply because it was the largest at 15 by 10.5 inches. It was already old then, and already nicknamed the hairy book, or rather Liber Pilosis, to give it its proper Latin moniker. Inside the clamshell box, the parchment folios are stitched into 17th-century heavy boards with a battered white leather binding that was once secured by two leather clasps which no longer close properly. Lift it out respectfully and settle it on grey foam wedges to support the spine. Turn to the very end of the volume and find there, attached to the back board, the 137th sheet or folio. Resist the urge to stroke it. It is a sheet of parchment made from animal skin, but one side is unshaven, still hairy with bald patches and piebald, but unmistakably the hide of a deer. The 15th century index describes it as co operatorium huius libri, that is the cover of this book. And this hairy cover of deerskin would once have formed part of the limp binding for the original folios. Limp, because there were no boards, a proto-paperback. So the cover was taken from a deer that was killed to make parchment for the scriptorium of St. Paul's Cathedral while Piers Shonks was still in his prime and hunting in the Pelhams. And we know this because of what we will find in this book. And scanning through all these deeds that I'd looked at many times for other reasons, I came to the witness list at the end one day, and there he was. Piers Shonks had witnessed this deal done in the 1240s. And so we knew he existed for certain. Didn't know much about him, but suddenly there became, as I went on looking, there was an embarrassment of riches. At Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, they have lots and lots of deeds from the Chamberlain family who were active in the 13th century in the Pelhams, and Shonks witnesses more of them than anybody else. Adam was a landowner and takes us back into the land, and we can start placing him there in field names we can still trace and imagine him witnessing livery of Suzanne, taking a clod of earth as a deal was done. And we find him as an elector to the jury at the 1248 assize, or the general air, where he presents cases of murder and robbery, and we can hear him giving the oath a jury member would give. And finally, I find evidence that reconciles this historical Piers Shonks with the earliest version of the legend. I find an explanation, but I'm not going to tell it you. You've got to read the book. It's my teaser. Okay. Okay. So I traced him back and I found the historical Shonks, and what was I left with? Throughout the whole writing of this book and the researching of it, I really wanted to treat the legend with respect. I think if you get to the end of it and say, oh, wow, I can tell you that there wasn't a dragon, that would be pretty pathetic. The most important thing about so many of these stories is the mythical element. They wouldn't be told, they wouldn't be remembered. No one would remember Piers Shonks without it. And it contains the greater truths. I tell a story in the book. It's very important to me in the book that this sort of battle between memory and forgetting, between iconoclasts and particularly rationalists who write about the tomb in the 18th century and dismiss the legend as foolish nonsense and don't quote the inscription above the tomb, which is very important. I haven't got time to talk about that. But they dismiss it as foolishness. And I tell a story about Jack O'Legs, who's another Hertfordshire giant from Weston, and he had a thigh bone that was sold by the churchwardens of Weston, sold to... that was subtle. Oh, gosh, sorry. I'll quickly wrap up. Sold to John Tredescant and ended up in the Ashmolean Museum, where it was the thigh bone of a giant, and within a few years was relabeled as the thigh bone of an elephant, and in no time at all was thrown away. And I do hope we live in times now where we were happier, and I'm speaking to the converted here, I know, but we're happier living in these spaces between myth and reality and find that they're really rich spaces to think in. I'll finish with, those of you who know Bruno Bettelheim will know this anecdote, and I use it at the end of the book, and I'm completely paraphrasing, but he gives an anecdote about the child psychologist Piaget, saying, he was interviewing this little girl, this troubled little girl who talked to him about elephants that could fly. And Piaget turns around and says, "Elephants can't fly, young lady." And Bettelheim says, wasn't that unfortunate? Why didn't he ask her questions about this flying elephant? And what you really want to know is, what colour's the elephant? How large are its wings? Where did it fly to? How often have you seen it fly? How high does it fly? And as well as trying to answer some of the factual questions in my book and get at the truth of things, I also try and ask some of these questions and have a crack at answering some of them. Thank you very much for listening.